Thank you all for coming to this briefing, which is on the record. My name is Edith Lederer from the Associated Press, and I wanted to start this briefing with a little bit of background. I happen to have been AP's chief correspondent at both the UN Population Conference in Cairo in 1994 and at the Beijing Women's Conference in 1995. At the UN Population Conference, 179 countries recognized for the first time that women have the right to control their reproductive and sexual health and to choose whether to become pregnant. While the conference broke a taboo on discussing sexuality, it stopped short of recognizing that women have the right to control decisions about when they have sex and when they get married. But the following year, at the 1995 UN Women's Conference in Beijing, the world's nations approved sexual rights for women, not just reproductive rights, as part of a very extensive 150-page platform for action to achieve equality for women. At the Beijing conference, then US First Lady Hillary Clinton galvanized delegates by saying these memorable words: "Human rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights." 20 years later, as US Secretary of State, she came to the United Nations and repeated those words. But she also stressed that much more needs to be done and declared that equality for women and achieving it is, quote, "the greatest unfinished business of the 21st century," close quote. Secretary General Antonio Guterres has spoken out against pushback on achieving gender equality, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director of UN Women, Asa Regner, and I hope I pronounced your name properly, to talk about what UN Women is doing to keep this push going.
Thank you so much. Welcome everybody, and thank you so much, Edith, for this introduction. And thank you to everybody else who arranged this today. Yes, I was also in Beijing in 1995, and that was surely a landmark conference, because I think that conference and the outcome to a large extent really made gender equality the important political issues on a global and on national agendas that it is today. However, many of those who are engaged in gender equality issues were not even born in 1995, and certainly not there. And I think the important thing is that the Beijing document is the only global action plan that we have for gender equality, and that's how I like to think about it. A global, extensive action plan for gender equality. So here today, I wanted to very briefly brief you on some of the developments since 1995, but also maybe most of all tell you how we want to honor the 25th anniversary of this global action plan coming up next year and coming up to next year. As you know, gender equality, or rather gender inequality, is a result of unjust power balances, where normally men are favored for being men and where women suffer for being women. And this global action plan that was decided upon in Beijing in 1995 tries to highlight 12 areas where this injustice can be turned into justice, and where women's power is as big as men's power over their own lives, but also in society. And we do have some results since 1995. There is a lot to say, but very briefly, for instance, more girls go to school today than ever before, and more countries have achieved gender parity in school enrollment. Obviously, very important for boys as well as for girls. We know that access to essential health services has improved in many countries, with global rates of childbirth with a skilled health professional up to more than 60% in 2000 from 61% in the year 2000 to almost 80% in the year 2016. Maternal mortality has gone down as a result of this. Also, over the past decade, almost 300 reforms to laws and regulations which are supporting gender equalities have been adopted in more than 130 countries all over the world, which is also a response to this action plan and the areas pointed out there. I think it is also a positive result from this conference. Edith pointed out that the UN and EU and other organizations work a lot with gender equality. I think this is one result of the importance that the Beijing platform gave to gender equality. But it's also true that women, peace and security is a very important and seriously taken issue at the Security Council, for instance. I think that is a result in as such. Gender equality in relation to labor market participation and economic power is another topic that's been taken very seriously, also by the private sector and stakeholders outside of politics, I would say. And a big issue that was not talked about at all as much as today is obviously violence against women, also violence from men who are close to women, which was an area considered to be a private business for women who happened to live under these unfortunate circumstances, and is nowadays a very important political issue, which is the responsibility for politicians and societies and legislators to deal with. However, there are also big challenges still remaining in this area. And this is about power structures, and they take a long time to change. And it's a fact that some of those who should be held accountable for this change has just not lived up to their responsibility here. We know, for instance, that this area is always, when evaluated, underfinanced. The budgets are simply not there nationally or internationally to support the programs that would be needed. And thus, we can't say that gender equality is actually achieved in any country in the world. We know that in 89 countries with available data, women and girls account for 330 million of the poor. And this translates to 4 more women living on less than 1.9 US dollars a day for every 100 men. 104 women and 100 men live with less than $2 a day, let's say. And this the gender gap is particularly wide during the reproductive years, which obviously makes it difficult, not least for single mothers, but also for all women, obviously, living under these circumstances, especially if they want to live on their own and make their own lives and their own ends meet. We know that more than 50% of urban women and girls in developing countries living conditions where they lack at least one of the following, either clean water, good sanitation facilities, durable housing, and sufficient living area. So more than half of urban women and girls live under these circumstances still, which is more than men in the same areas. And although we know that violence against women is such a harmful thing, still 1 of 5 women under the age of 50 report that they experience physical and or sexual violence by an intimate partner, or that they have experienced this during the last 12 months. So there is still a lot to do, although some progress has been made. We therefore believe that the anniversary coming up in 2020 is a good opportunity to open the space to both talk about these implementation gaps, but also to invite those who are maybe not even born in 1995 or who for other reasons could not participate in that meeting or in these discussions. Next year, we have 3 different events I want to mention to you, which will highlight this anniversary. We will also kick off with a campaign around this already now, but I'll start by telling you about these 3 events. Next year's Commission on the Status of Women will dedicate itself to the celebration of the Beijing Plus 25, or the follow-up, let's say, of the this global action plan for gender equality. As always, the Commission on the Status of Women will be a high-level meeting. Normally, as you know, the delegations which come are led by ministers. And we foresee a big meeting. In fact, the Commission on the Status of Women has grown every year. Last year, or this year, in 2019, was the largest meeting ever. Christine, I'm looking at you, yes. With big participation both from civil society and from delegations, and we foresee at least that participation next year. We think that that is very important to get some kind of common idea about how far we've come. We have also asked all member states to report to us where they are when it comes to implementing these global promises on gender equality. And that will be a very, very important background for us, because that is, as far as we know, the only document of its kind when we gather all the data. And we have really asked for data, statistics, and hard evidence on how far the world has come on gender equality. So we will get that now this spring in order to prepare the Commission on the Status of Women next year in March. There will also be a short declaration as a conclusion of what the member states and civil society discuss at that meeting. Also, parts of the General Assembly next year will dedicate itself to the anniversary of the Beijing Conference. In between those 2 important intergovernmental events at the UN, there will be a global forum hosted by France and co-hosted by Mexico, but in France, with obviously cooperation from the UN, and mostly focusing on civil society's participation to a debate about future gender equality needs, demands, and trends. As you know, the 12 areas in the Beijing platform, many of them, and I mentioned some of them, are very relevant and important still today. But we assume that some areas will be put on a list for future gender equality attention, which are not as prominent in the Beijing agenda. we guess they will be, for instance, climate change and gender equality. We suppose that not least young gender equality activists think that that is a very important area. Probably issues around artificial intelligence could also be something which activists would point at as important issues for a future gender equality area, for future gender equality work to point at. I'm sure lots of themes, topics related to women, peace and security would also be put on a future agenda for attention for gender equality, but maybe made through a lens of younger activists who were not born in 1995. Although we think that we will really gear this meeting towards the young activists and civil society of today, I also think that lots of issues about demographic change and needs of elderly women is probably also something that could be discussed at this forum. So the purpose of that meeting is to gather today's activism around gender equality and give not least us at UN Women and the UN a good sense of what is relevant to a new generation when it comes to gender equality. It will, however, not be any intergovernmental negotiations. It's not an intergovernmental meeting or formal meeting in that sense. It is, however, an important platform, we think, to discuss and to revitalize a debate around gender equality in the world, with a focus on those with the biggest needs, women and girls in the most dire situation in the world, because that is the main focus of UN Women and the UN. So in order to kick this off and to catch attention maybe of those who are not so involved of all of this, we will start with a campaign called Generation Equality, which actually starts now. And the first station for this campaign train will be the Women Deliver Conference in Vancouver in June. And there will be lots of different activities online, at conferences and in different member states to prepare everybody for the anniversary of the Beijing platform debates, and most of all to highlight the needs to make progress when it comes to gender equality and to implement all these reforms. That is important as a political project, but more to change women, girls, men's and boys' lives in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I wonder if you could start out by defining what you mean by generation equality.
Thank you for that question. Yes, as I said, I was in Beijing myself in 1995. I wasn't even young then, I was 30. But we see that the fight for gender equality has to a large extent been carried by women and always a few men. Too few, I think. But some men have always shown solidarity with women, but women are usually the ones carrying these very heavy issues to highlight gender equality issues, to protect other women, to legislate, to fight for these issues. And I also want to point out that doing that job in the world today as women rights defenders is getting increasingly dangerous. UN Women, one part of UN Women's work is to keep contact with activists in the world, to support them, to work with them. And unfortunately, we see that more and more of this work is getting defunded, but sometimes individual activists are actually also getting detained or even killed in countries where they work. Now, this work, I mean, the change takes a long time, and it is a power struggle, and there is resistance there. So it has been going 4 generations, and we hope with this Generation Equality campaign to make women and men and young and older gender equality activists to meet and to discuss, to compare the fights from yesterday with the future fights, how they can support each other and learn from each other. And I suppose also have different views on how this work should be should be done in future.
So is one of the aims to have as many men as women in these events?
We would certainly hope so. As I said, normally the gender equality agenda is carried by women, and we want to honor the women who very courageously has worked so hard and work hard all over the world, and sometimes under dangerous conditions. But we also see an enormous gain when men and boys engage in the same work. There are definitely also areas where boys and men would benefit from a more gender equal society. For instance, closeness to men's own small children, being an active father for a man. And we know that in some countries, boys lag behind in education. And education is more and more important in this world. So we hope for men to both engage in areas that are important from them for a gender equality point of view, but also to show solidarity with women and girls in this fight.
Let me open the floor to questions. Are there any questions from any of us? Otherwise, I'll keep going. Ellen.
Yeah. Ellen Wolfors with the Thomson Reuters Foundation. Oh,
Hi.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Can you elaborate a little bit on hold on a second, here. Asking member states to report on the status of their progress on gender equality. You're saying, can you just give me an idea of what form that will be, how you will ask them, when that's due? You said, you mean this spring?
Yes.
Now?
Yes.
Okay.
The exact date I'll have to ask my colleagues here, but we have asked all member states to report, the governments to report on implementation progress and implementation gaps when it comes to the 12 areas in the Beijing platform. And we have also asked them to do that based on evidence, data, statistics, and also, when possible, in a comparable way, so that we actually know what has been done and what has not been done in terms of implementing the agreements on violence, for instance, or more women in peace negotiations, or more women on the labor market. And this is due when? I don't know, Christine, if you want to.
On the 1st of May.
1st of May, which is
last week.
but some have reported they might be later. So during May, we will get the reports.
Do you have a sense of the compliance rate? What kind of, is everybody cooperating, or what's it?
I don't think we have that picture yet, or Christine, do you have any idea?
Well, perhaps just to add that UN Women actually did put out a guidance note that also included a questionnaire for the national reports last September, and we did that together with the 5 regional commissions of the UN. We also, in agreement with the regional commissions, initially set the 1st of May as the deadline, the suggested deadline for member states to submit their reports. The regional commissions will use the national reports to undertake and put together a regional trends analysis, because one element in the preparatory process for the celebration next year are the regional intergovernmental meetings that the 5 regional commissions of the UN will convene later in the fall, in late October, early November in particular. And so the regional commissions will use the national reports to undertake their regional trends analysis, and we in turn will use them for the global trends analysis. And it's actually, I think, very positive what we are hearing so far. On the 1st of May, we had about 22 reports, which I thought was quite a good compliance rate. We have also received from quite a few member states information that their reports will be forthcoming in the next few weeks. So we actually do anticipate a large number of reports. For Beijing Plus 20, we received 167 reports. So that is a very high number. And we would actually, optimistic as we are, anticipate that we will potentially get even more reports for Beijing Plus 25. Those 22 reports that we have already received have been posted on the website. Also because they just came in, we have not yet undertaken an analysis to see what's actually in the reports, but they are publicly available, and all those that will be forthcoming will also be posted on the website. So hopefully by, very many will submit their reports by the end of May, early June at the latest. But at a global level, anything that we will be receiving through September will also become part of the global trends analysis. Thank you.
Any other questions? A follow-up from me on this, and then I'll give the floor to Dulce. Are you going to be putting out a global trends analysis before CSW next year?
Yes, indeed. That's the intention. So we will do the report in late fall. The national reports of member states will be a large part of the trends analysis in terms of where member states stand in implementation, where they see progress, where they see gaps, but in particular also what they identify as some of the key areas from their national perspective for future action. So we also hope, and that was also one of the questions in the guidance note, where member states do see the key areas for further progress that would then also hopefully really accelerate progress across the board. There are certain bottlenecks. If you tackle those, that you then have actually accelerated action and implementation also in other areas. So that report, and then we will also use other information, data that are being collected on a regular basis, including also in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so that comprehensive report will be out at the latest at the end of January 2020. Thank you.
Dulce?
Yeah, a couple of things about this CSW event. What do you mean by a short declaration of the conclusion of the meeting? What specifically do you have in mind? And how are you going to deal with the pushback from that we saw this year, mostly from anti-abortion groups? Presumably the crowd will be even bigger and there'll be more petitioning by them, including threats to the chairwoman of the CSW outcome document negotiations. So how are you anticipating this role? Thanks.
Thank you. If I start maybe on the pushback, and Christine can talk about the declaration, how that's thought. You're absolutely right. This is a development that we've seen at the Commission on the Status of Women, as you describe it. I think also parts of it at the Security Council. At the UN and at UN Women, we have a very particular task, and that is to both defend, to contribute to implementation of, and to advance, when possible, the international agreements that we have on gender equality. So obviously we are not neutral or impartial to rights. We are here to work for women's and girls' rights and for gender equality. And we will continue to do so. That's why we also think that next year will give us lots of opportunities to discuss gender equality. It is very important to both see the pushback that you're talking about, but also the fact that the majority of member states and the great majority of civil society coming to the CSW this year are also in favor of progress of gender equality. And we are very proud that we had a good outcome also with new language in areas where we didn't have one before, and also where very basic and the most important principles of gender equality were part of the conclusions. However, as you say, I think that we do have to realize that there is a new reality when it comes to gender equality. And we have to work very well together with allies also reach out to those who might have other opinions, but we will never back down on the mandate or on the task that we have. I think that the UN has a good opportunity to show its added value when it comes to supporting and defending human rights and women's rights and gender equality right now. Yeah, sorry, the declaration.
Thank you. As you know, the usual outcome of the annual session of the Commission on the Status of Women are so-called agreed conclusions that are negotiated by member states on the priority theme. At CSW 63, the priority theme was on social protection systems, public services, and sustainable development for gender equality and the empowerment of women. At CSW 64, the Commission will undertake a review and appraisal of the implementation of the Platform for Action in its entirety, and it's the practice of the Commission that on the occasion of so-called +5 review and appraisal sessions, the outcome is a declaration or political declaration. That was the case in 2015, in 2010, and also in 2005. In 2000, the General Assembly convened a special session, so that was a different type of outcome. It will be up to the member states to decide what format or content the political declaration, whether they will indeed wish once again to adopt a political declaration, and what type of format and content such a political declaration will take. The Bureau of the Commission is usually the body that discusses and then consults with the member states on their expectations and on the actual outcome, and then also facilitates the negotiations of a text for the session. So it will be up to the member states to then determine how exactly they wish to proceed and what content the outcome will have at CSW 64. Thank you.
Ellen?
Just to follow up, can you elaborate in your words what the pushback is, what the new reality is regarding, can you elaborate please in your words what the pushback is and what the new reality is when it comes to gender equality, please?
Yeah, I think it's become obvious for those of us who follow gender equality, global gender equality policies closely, that in some parts of the world there are governments and movements who value so-called traditional family values and other ideas around women's and men's roles, both in families and in societies, which do not correspond to international agreements and which would not necessarily give women the space and possibility to decide over their own lives, bodies, economic empowerment, etc. Therefore, we see, I think, from UN Women, two trends at the same time. We see a lot of support for gender equality, a lot of support, and also a lot of knowledge, and we have a lot of evidence nowadays that we didn't have 1995, for instance. And also many member states who come forward and actually ask for more of support, and they also offer us their support because they want to work on gender equality. They see that as a very important area to advance the societies of the countries that they are responsible for. Whereas other member states have another view on that. And that came forward, I think, quite clearly during the Commission on the Status of Women in different discussions. And now this is an area where everybody has the right to have his or her opinion, obviously, but we stick to the fact that our task is to honor the agreements that we have, and they are not yet implemented. We see that the lack of implementation holds women back and actually keeps women in poverty, keeps their children in poverty. It makes societies less peaceful and less prosperous when parts of society is not allowed to contribute with knowledge, their working hours and what have you. So for us, we keep the eyes on the task that we have. And the UN is there to dialogue with everybody, and we do that. We try to do that in a respectful way, but we also have to find ways of keep working on the task that we have, and not least to do that together with those who knock on our doors and say they want to work with us.
Any other questions? A final question from me on this whole idea of pushback. What do you say to countries that are trying to actually roll back on the platform for action that was adopted in Beijing?
Well, as I said, the good news for us is that we already have substantive agreement and agreements and the convention and so on to stick to, important resolutions in the Security Council and so on. We already have that task, and it's very important to remind about that. So I think that a very important thing is to talk in a facts-based way, and to also point at the knowledge that we have today that, for instance, I think obviously that for women to be involved in peace agreements, for instance, is first and foremost their right. It is their right as well as men's right to be part of that conversation. But we know for a fact that peace agreements where women have been part are much more sustainable than other peace agreements. And we know that now. So I think our approach is to put those facts on the table and insist on the fact that we have the task to advance societies this way. And I think it's also very important to not accept threats, as you mentioned. The UN is a platform for dialogue, for respect, and threats do not have a place in that conversation. I think that from our point of view, we want to engage with good arguments and in a peaceful and respectful way. That's the added value of the UN. But I think that those who work hard for gender equality in governments or in organizations, in schools, in wherever, they should know that the UN is very determined to advance this agenda. Thank you.
Dulce?
Yeah, can I just ask, backing up to the data reports you're getting?
Wait 1 second for the mic.
The reports you're asking from each member state about their data on gender equality. So have you received the report from the United States yet? And given the fact that they have stripped their human rights reports of any sexual and reproductive health language, how are you going to deal with that missing data? Thanks.
To the best of my knowledge, and again, that was as of Friday, we received 22 reports. I don't recall that the US report was among those. And the information, member states are invited to submit those reports. So there is an expectation that they will provide as much information as they have and wish to share globally in a document that's public and available on the website. You are also aware that, for example, under the Sustainable Development Goals, there are many indicators that are tracked on a regular basis, including on Goal 5, which also looks at the question of sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights. And the relevant indicators to those provide some opportunity to also compile the data globally in regards to those rights. Thank you.
Can I just add maybe one more?
Please.
I think that obviously I represent UN Women, so and UN Women is an important organization in the UN system when it comes to gender equality. But I do see that the whole UN system is working very hard with gender equality, and there are lots of drivers in favor of gender equality, and not least the Secretary General himself is working hard on these issues on a daily basis. So we are here today to brief you on activities in relation to the celebration next year, but gender equality, daily gender equality work is also a very present reality at the UN in general. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming, and we'll look forward to next year and the 25th anniversary celebrations. Thank you.
Thank you for your interest.
Thank you.
And please be in touch.